Hello everyone, welcome to my messy studio. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, we're going to compare 7 different kinds of pen types commonly used in pen and ink drawing. I'm going to talk about the general properties of each, their advantages and disadvantages, and explain why you might want to use one over the other. Let's get started. Before I begin, I should note that making a comprehensive comparison of all 7 pen types is very difficult, since pens within each category come in a dizzying variety. My goal here is to provide you with a general comparison between pen types. Here are the representatives for each pen type I'm going to look at. For the felt tip liner, the Faber-Castell Pitt Artist Pen. For the gel pen, the Arts Hybrid Technica made by Pentel. For the felt tip brush pen, this one made by Zebra, the Sensations Brush Pen. For the technical pen, the Isograph made by Rotring. For the ballpoint pen, the Bic Crystal. For the fountain pen, the TWSBI Eco, and lastly, for the dip pen, a nib holder fitted with a Tachikawa 600 EF nib. Let's start with the felt tip liner. These pens feature a soft fiber tip and come in a variety of sizes, from a microscopic 0.15mm all the way to a broad 0.5mm. While some brands come in a range of ink colors, black filled pens are far and away the most common. The black ink in these is wholly waterproof and light fast. While most of these are disposable, the brand Copic makes a pen with replaceable tips and refillable cartridges. In the consistency tests, all 3 thicknesses of the felt tip performed perfectly, putting down lines in every direction and at every speed without skipping. This is one advantage of felt tips. Provided that they're not dried up or worn down, they can be relied on to put down a consistent line. This is not the case with fountain pens or dip pens, which sometimes suffer all sorts of flaws that need to be addressed before the pen will write well. With these pens, you can take the cap off and go. In the line variation test, you can make these pens write thicker with additional pressure, but you have to be careful, since these pens are not meant to be used this way. Since more pressure can be applied to the wider tips, the effect is more visible there. You can also tease out a lighter line by holding the pen at a flatter angle, which puts down a very thin, scratchy line, good for initial light sketching. In the feedback test, these pens are on the scratchier side, but that's highly dependent on the paper and of course the tip size. That said, I think the sound of the felt tip running across the paper makes the pen sound much scratchier than it actually is. In the ink flow test, the pen is super duper dry, drying in a second or two. This makes it ideal for working on cheap paper where striking through or feathering is an issue. It's also ideal in situations where you want to go over your drawing with washes and don't want to wait extended periods of time for the ink to dry. Let's do a drawing with these pens and talk about their advantages and disadvantages. The felt tip liner has a number of significant things going for it. The first is reliability and ease of use. These pens work with perfect consistency, never skip or drip, and will perform as expected every single time. They're also hassle-free and require no tuning or cleaning. This makes these pens a risk and stress-free choice for professional projects. Furthermore, the inks in these pens have been tested for light fastness, so you don't have to worry about your drawings fading over time. And they're light, portable, and cheap, making them great for sketching outdoors. As for disadvantages, there are a number. The first, and most important, is that for most people, there's a limited range of ink choices. Though these pens are now available in a variety of colors, the choices are still limited, especially compared to the huge range of choices available to users of fountain pens and dip pens. Furthermore, the limited range of colors is not the only limitation, since ink has a number of different properties, including transparency and flow, that an artist might want to control. Another disadvantage, and really the main reason I don't often use them, is that you cannot vary the line thickness with these pens. That is to say, you can't make a line start thin and go thicker the way you could with either a dip pen or a fountain pen. While there are workarounds, by methodically widening each line, this limits the feeling of spontaneity that you get through the ability to vary the lines through pressure. In short, these are very practical pens that produce very uniform results, which is why they're the choice for many illustrators, architectural and technical draftsmen, and anyone looking for hassle-free precision. But they offer a one-size-fits-all drawing experience that might feel constricting to those who wish to explore various ink options and experiment with different kinds of line quality. Now let's talk about another artist favorite, the gel pen. These are essentially ballpoint pens which have a much more fluid ink, creating smoother lines and a drawing experience closer to that of a fountain pen. There are quite a few available on the market, some sold for general stationery purposes like the Pilot G2, and some like this one, designed specifically for drawing. This pen is the Pentel Arts Hybrid Technica. Like the felt tip liners, these come in a variety of widths, with a Pentel line starting at a very fine 0.2mm going all the way up to a 0.8mm. While most commonly filled with black ink, they also come in a variety of colors depending on the brand. The ink in this pen is fully waterproof, but this will not be the case with all gel pens. Let's take this pen through my series of tests and see how it performs. This pen, much like the felt tip, puts down clean lines in every direction and at every speed. Not every gel pen will do this, however. This gel pen has a cap that seals tightly over the tip, preventing it from drying out. Gel pens that are retractable will have a tendency to dry out a little, but you can easily get them working by putting down a few lines before starting your drawing. While the lines here are mostly clean, the pen sometimes puts down specks of ink at the beginning of each line, probably due to ink buildup on the tip. This is a minor issue, but should be considered if you're doing careful work where line quality really matters. In the line variation test, this pen did not produce any, even with pressure. But like the felt tip, it can also produce a thin, scratchy line when held at an angle, something very useful for the initial sketch in the drawing process. While this is not a pen for people that enjoy line variation, I find that working on soft papers will actually affect how much line variation you get. On softer paper, extra pressure will make this pen dig into the surface, creating a thicker line. However, this is an effect that I think is easier to achieve with a regular ballpoint pen. In the feedback test, I would say that these pens are somewhat scratchy, but in a different way than the felt tip fine liners. The difference is that while the felt tip scrapes across the drawing surface, in the gel pen you can feel the slight resistance of the rollerball as you put down a stroke. Does this difference in the type of feedback make any actual difference in the drawing experience? That's something we'll discuss when I do my drawing test. In the wetness department, this pen was very dry, much like the fine liner. That said, in places where the ink was built up, the drying time is extended. This has to do with the viscosity of the ink, which has a tendency to sit on the surface of the paper. But that thicker ink also makes it better than the fine liner for working on very thin paper, where strike-through or feathering will be an issue. Let's take this pen out for a drawing test and see how it does in real-life situations. I'm using two sizes of this pen here, the 0.4 and the 0.8mm, and I have to say I was pleasantly surprised by the drawing experience. This pen produced a very thin, consistent line that felt easy to control, easier to control than the felt tip. I think this is because the way this pen's metal tip makes contact with the paper feels more familiar to me as a user of fountain pens and dip pens. Also with the felt tip, especially in the finer sizes, you always have this feeling that you're going to damage the tip if you're too rough. No such hesitation happens with this pen, freeing you to put down as much pressure as you like and go as fast as you want. The performance of this pen was not perfect, and there are a few places where the ink left little specks at the beginning of the line. Because of the speckling issue, I would not use this pen for highly finished work where line quality matters, but as a tool for sketching, this pen has a significant advantage over the felt tip. These pens work on less than ideal surfaces, the rollerball gliding over rough papers, and the gel ink sitting politely on the surface of papers that are overly absorbent. This is why they're so often found in the pockets of artists that sketch obsessively, who need something portable and cheap that'll work on anything: paper napkins, receipts, and wedding certificates. The main drawback of this pen is the same as the felt tip, however. Whatever brand of gel pen you choose, this is still a one-size-fits-all drawing implement in terms of ergonomics, ink choices, and overall drawing experience. Let's move on to the Zebra brush pen. We need to first make a distinction between this and other types of brush pens on the market. This pen doesn't have an actual brush tip composed of hairs, but is made of a material similar to the felt tip liners. However, unlike some felt tip brush pens that are very long and very flexible, the tip on this pen is short and sharp, making it more suitable for putting down fine lines with just a touch of line variation. This particular brand comes in a few different sizes: ultra fine, fine, and medium, this one being the ultra fine. Like the previous two pens, this pen is disposable and uses black, waterproof ink that the company claims is light-fast and permanent. Let's take it through my series of tests. In the consistency tests, this pen was a touch disappointing in that the lines were scrapey and dry, particularly when I sped up my strokes. This paper is smooth, so I imagined that on even rougher paper it would struggle even more. Not a good start to things. Fortunately, in the line variation tests, this pen performed very well, putting down a fine line all the way to something approaching 2 millimeters. This is an impressive amount of line variation, and best of all, unlike some of the very flexible brush pens, it was easy to control. The fact is, finding a tool with that right balance of flexibility and control is difficult, and this pen has just the right balance. While dip pens and fountain pens also offer line variation, they're difficult to use since you can only thicken the lines on the downstroke, and those lines often end up being very wet, so you have to be careful what kind of paper you use them on. With this brush pen, you can get all the benefits of having line variation without all the complications that come with using a dip pen or a fountain pen. In the feedback department, this pen is scratchy even on smooth paper. This pen has the same fibrous tip as the felt tip liner, but since the tip is very sharp, the sense of scratchiness is amplified. This is not a deal breaker, but something that takes a bit of getting used to. This really is a whole new drawing instrument, very unlike the brush pens or felt tip liners I'm used to working with, and it's really not fair to judge it using the same criteria. And in the wetness test, the pen is bone dry. While this is why it struggled in the consistency test, it's also its main advantage. While other pens that produce decent line variation usually write very wet, think flexible fountain pens, this pen can produce line variation while still being very dry. In terms of feel, this pen is a bit like a felt tip fine liner, no surprise since the tip seems to be made of a similar material. While the dry, slightly scrapey lines were less than elegant, the line variation was easy to control and entirely problem-free, even at speed. That's something that can't always be said for flex pens, which often suffer problems when you're working quickly or applying too much pressure. Furthermore, flexible dip pens and fountain pens require generous ink flow to work well, which means that a little shake can cause them to splatter ink. No risk of that happening here. And unlike the wet lines made by dip pens or fountain pens, which can take a very long time to dry, the lines here dry in a few seconds. The downside is that, once again, you're dealing with a one-size-fits-all experience in terms of flexibility, dryness, and ink choices. I know I keep harping on this issue, and perhaps I should stop, but I really do prefer an instrument that I can adjust to my preference, at least in the type of ink it uses. Yes, this pen, like the felt tip liner, is stress and hassle-free, but give me stress and hassle in exchange for versatility every single time. Up next, we have the technical pen. This type of pen delivers ink through a hollow metal tip, and before the computer age was popular among technical illustrators. Unlike the previous three pens, which are disposable, this pen is usually refillable, using a little plastic reservoir that you fill up with ink. This particular pen is called the Isograph and is made by Rotring. Like the felt tip, it comes in a very large variety of sizes, from the tiny 0.1 millimeter all the way up to a 1 millimeter tip. And since the tips on these pens can be bought separately and easily switched out, you don't have to buy separate pens if you want to work with different line widths. This pen uses a specially formulated waterproof ink that is available in a limited number of colors. Let's see how this pen performs in my series of tests. The technical pen is different from the other pens in that it needs to be held at a more or less vertical angle to work well, though you can't create rough broken lines when you hold it at an angle. It's also sensitive to speed and starts to skip when you speed up. However, if you're holding it at the correct angle and don't go too quickly, the line it puts down is as consistent as the felt tip. In the line variation test, this pen has absolutely none, even less than the gel pen or the felt tip, as is to be expected. This pen is designed to put down a consistent line width, which is why it's so commonly used in lettering and technical illustration. In the feedback test, this pen is very smooth so long as you're holding it at a vertical angle. At other angles, it becomes scratchy and skippy. And in the wetness test, this pen shows itself to be surprisingly dry, considering that in some ways it operates similarly to a fountain pen. Let's try drawing with it and see how it works in practice. Drawing with a technical pen is very different than using other materials, again, in that the pen has to be held at a more vertical angle, and that you have to keep your strokes relatively slow. While this is definitely not a pen for you if you enjoy line variation and fast drawing, what it does extremely well, which is to put down super sharp lines. And because you can get tips for it all the way down to 0.1 millimeter, this is a fantastic choice for precise work. The ink used in it is very black and completely waterproof, making this pen an ideal choice to combine with washes. And this is the pen most commonly used for stippling, since it creates perfectly round marks. The disadvantage of this pen is mainly the unusual writing angle, which limits the kind of strokes you can create, and of course the complete lack of line variation. Furthermore, though this pen can be used with a number of inks, it works best with ink specifically designed for technical pens, and these are available only in a few very limited number of colors. Now let's discuss the Humble ballpoint pen. This instrument is similar to the gel pen, but the ink it uses is considerably more viscous and more transparent, so it performs differently. This particular pen is the Bic Cristal 1.6 millimeter and is a popular choice among artists and comes filled with many colors of ink, all of them waterproof. Let's take it through my series of tests and see how it performs. In the consistency test, this pen took a few strokes to start up, but then delivered an unbroken line in every direction. These pens do have issues sometimes with hard starts and have a tendency to clog if not used regularly. And I wouldn't expect one to work if it sat inactive in your drawer for several months. In the line variation test, this pen has quite a bit of it due to the way the ball tip can press into the paper to create thicker lines. And this effect is amplified on softer papers. Furthermore, unlike the slight line variation you can get from felt tips, the line thickness here is easily controllable, and I don't have to worry that I'm going to damage the tip. In the feedback department, this pen glides smoothly across the paper similar to a gel pen, but since the ink is a touch more viscous, there's greater resistance. I guess resistance and feedback are really two different things, but in testing this huge variety of pen types, I'm conflating them. In the wetness test, these pens are bone dry, the driest of all the pens in this comparison, but with a caveat. The ink here is thick and sits entirely on the surface, and as a result, in areas where there's heavy line work, it'll have a tendency to smear. The ballpoint pen is an outlier in this comparison, in that the line it puts down has the softness and transparency of a color pencil, and yet retains the sharpness of edge of a pen. While other pens can to some extent be used to create similar work, the results attained with a ballpoint cannot be achieved with anything else. In terms of drawing experience, I find it very pleasant to use and to control, the easiest of all the pen types, and by far. With a light touch, it can create the lightest, wispiest lines, and is super responsive to pressure, creating lovely line variation. The lines here are neither crisp nor elegant, but they are expressive, again, feeling like a cross between a pencil and a pen. This pen is really the perfect tool for the obsessive sketcher. The viscosity of the ink allows you to use it on every kind of paper, and its tremendous range of line quality allows you to do quick sketches and even highly rendered work. The disadvantages of this pen is mainly that because they're not designed for art making, the ink in them is of questionable light fastness and permanence. Also, the ink in these, though waterproof, can smear, which means you have to be careful how these drawings are stored. Now let's shift our attention to the dip pen. Dip pen nibs come in a huge variety, but for drawing generally fall into two sizes. Crow nibs, which fit into this little brown crow nib holder, and larger size nibs that fit into a standard size holder. Crow nibs are usually very fine and designed for detail, and the standard sizes are usually better for larger work, but can also come in very fine sizes. Here I'm working with a dip pen holder made by Speedball, fitted with one of my favorite all-purpose drawing nibs, the Tachikawa 600 EF. Since the dip pen is so incredibly varied, testing a single dip nib is somewhat pointless, but let's do it anyway and see if we can draw some general conclusions about the dip pen from the process. In terms of consistency, the dip pen can occasionally cause problems, skipping or just not working at all. But due to its simplicity, correcting the occasional misalignment of tines or clogged ink channel, getting them working is a very easy process. However, if you're one of those people that doesn't like to fiddle with nibs or get their hands dirty, I would stick with the other pen types. In terms of line variation, dip pens can create more than any other pen type, and the great thing is that there's a huge range of flexibility between nibs, going from completely stiff to so soft and flexible that only calligraphy experts can control them. For those that love the added expression that line variation adds to a drawing, the dip pen is an essential tool. In terms of feedback, dip pens are usually quite scratchy because the nibs don't have the smooth rounded tipping you often find on fountain pen nibs. The advantage of this is that lines made with a dip pen are sharper and more elegant, but you have to be careful how you use them, since the sharp tines on some dip pens can cross and splatter if you make a stroke in the wrong direction. Nowadays you can find nibs that have rounded tips like you find on fountain pens, but I think it's worth taking the time to learn how to operate a dip pen rather than resort to using something easier. In the wetness test, these pens are generally very wet writing, but this will depend on the nib. Wetness is also highly dependent on the ink being used. But don't expect dip pens to write as dry as felt tip liners or gel pens, and be sure to use them on papers that are designed for aqueous media to avoid feathering and striking through. Let's take this dip pen out for a spin and talk about the advantages and disadvantages of this tool. As I see it, the main advantage is that there are so many different kinds of dip pens to choose from. This variety means that over time you can find a nib or a number of nibs perfectly suited to your way of working. And if you want to go further, they can be tuned to work exactly to your preference. This is something that I think is overlooked in art instruction. A great tool has to meet us halfway. That is to say that to some extent we have to come to a tool by learning how to use it properly and understand its weaknesses and strengths, and to ultimately emphasize those strengths and work around the weaknesses. But a tool should over time also be versatile enough so that it comes to you, that it can be adjusted to your specific preferences. This is where the dip pen outperforms the other pens in this comparison. That versatility also extends to ink choices, which for dip pens come in a mind-boggling variety. And since these inks can be mixed and diluted with ease, the possibilities are literally endless. Best of all, the ease with which you can switch inks with a dip pen make it possible to seamlessly use a number of inks in a single drawing. They even work well with watercolors, something I demonstrated in a recent mini lesson. The drawbacks are that this is not the most portable pen type, and in the field it's an awkward way of working. The other disadvantage is that it can get messy even in the studio. You always have to be careful how much ink is on your nib, and with some of the very flexible nibs you have to be careful on the side strokes, or the tines can cross and splatter. However, these are things that can be overcome through practice and habit, and since the advantages of the dip pen easily overwhelm the drawbacks, this is a drawing implement every artist should learn how to use. And finally, let's talk about the fountain pen. These come in a huge range of prices, materials, nib types, filling systems, with the added complication that you can buy modern as well as vintage pens. The representative for the entire category is one of my favorite fountain pens, the TWSBI Eco. Let's take it through my tests and talk about fountain pens in general. In the consistency test is where the fountain pen is probably the weakest of these 7 pen types, with skipping, burping, and other problems being much more common, even among popular and expensive models. Sometimes the problem is easily fixed, caused by a misaligned nib or a clogged feed, but sometimes the problems lie deeper and are not so easy to remedy. In the flexibility department, fountain pens have almost as much range as the dip pen, though the extremes of fineness and flexibility are not so common. The great thing, and one of the reasons why I love working with fountain pens so much, is that just about any pen will yield some line variation if you want it. Case in point is this TWSBI, which uses a non-flex nib that's still able to write wider with pressure. In the feedback department, the range is huge, from glass smooth to just as toothy as a dip pen. This is where the fountain pen shines. Yes, dip pens have more variety of widths and flexibilities, but the majority of them have quite a bit of feedback, whereas fountain pens sometimes have nibs that are so polished that you barely feel the paper. In the wetness department, the fountain pen surpasses the dip pen in variety. The feeds that provide ink flow to these types of pens can range from very dry to super wet, and can actually be adjusted to your preference. This is also dependent on ink type, which in variety is second only to drawing inks used in dip pens. Let's take this pen out for a drawing test and talk about the advantages and disadvantages of this pen category. As I see it, fountain pens have a number of significant advantages over the other pens I've discussed. The first is the variety of pen bodies available, ranging in size, weight, balance, and the way they're filled. You can even find ones made of solid gold and encrusted with diamonds. While the other pens don't leave you much of a choice in terms of ergonomics and are often only marginally comfortable, with a fountain pen you can find the perfect pen body to fit your hand. When it comes to nibs, the variety is second only to the dip pen, and besides the range of available nibs you can buy out of the box, you can also customize them to your liking. Furthermore, the feeds can also be adjusted, so you can tune the pen to write as wet as you'd like. The customizability of fountain pens ensures that with some research and experimentation, you'll find the exact pen or the exact 100 pens for you. And that variety applies to fountain pen inks as well, which, though not quite as rangy as what's available for the dip pen, is still incredibly varied. The fountain pen also comes with drawbacks, the main one being that they're fussy, requiring cleaning and maintenance. Some pens are better than others, but even the best ones will sometimes fail to write well. In most cases, a simple fix will get them writing again, but if you're out in the field and your pen doesn't work, you might be out of luck. Another disadvantage is that fountain pens are significantly more expensive than other pen options. While you can get a decently working pen for $5, the really good options, such as a TWSBI Eco, start at about $30. So, after this extensive comparison, what are my conclusions? The biggest takeaway is that the drawing tests produced no clear winner, with the drawings being more or less the same quality. In some of the drawings I made mistakes, but that had nothing to do with the pen, but was rather the result of a sloppy underdrawing. Some of the pens, such as the Isograph, were initially slightly harder to use, only because I wasn't used to working with them, and I still managed to get passable results. This is because it's the skill of the artist and not the pen being used that makes the biggest difference. That said, the materials you work with play an integral part in the art-making process and should be chosen carefully. Note that although these drawings were done in black ink, on the same paper, using the same reference, they look pretty different from each other. This is a consequence of the different grip, angle, pressure, and speed required to draw with them, and is comparable to the way the same notes played on different musical instruments will produce different music. This is the primary consideration in choosing a pen. Do you like the quote-unquote music the pen makes? Does it put down lines in the way that you find pleasing? With the exception of 3 practical considerations, everything else, portability, reliability, ergonomics, and wetness of the pen, should come a distant second. So what are these 3 practical considerations? Well, they're line variation, ink choices, and customizability. In all 3, the fountain pen and the dip pen reign supreme. However, you still have your work cut out for you since there's so many of them to try. Last thing I'd like to say is that unfortunately, choosing what pen to work with isn't a simple question of doing what I did, grabbing a bunch of pens, and running some quick comparative tests. At the risk of irritating everyone with another musical analogy, but just like it takes a musician years to understand the full range of possibility of their instrument, to make a truly informed decision about which pen type to use takes time and practice. So my advice is to research what each pen type can do, find one you like, and settle in. Work fast and slow, large and small, try it on different papers with different subject matter. If you ultimately realize that the pen is not for you, that time will not have been wasted, since drawing is drawing, and you will have gained valuable skills applicable to the next pen you're going to try. Furthermore, I don't know how many times over the years I've tried a material, stopped using it for whatever reason, only to come back to it because it happened to be perfectly suited for a particular project. Had I not spent years farting around with different materials, my internal library art supplies would have been poorer, and the quality of that project would have suffered for it. I hope you enjoyed this comparison of 7 different pen types, and if not, feel free to abuse me in the comments section, explain in detail what pens I should have tried and how I should have used them. Just be sure to first subscribe and stay tuned for more content you vehemently disagree with. My hope for this channel is that it becomes a platform for these kinds of honest, unfettered discussions. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye-bye.